And it's like, okay, be a magical unicorn, solve everything, and we're not going to acknowledge the fact that education, the classroom space, the nonprofit space is very antagonistic to the lived experience and the functionality of like how we're reared as Black men.
Mm.
Like it's like, right, like you think about like the school to prison pipeline, even going back to, our childhood, and the fact that like, we are criminalized, as Black boys in classrooms for being children. That same dynamic exists. It doesn't go away. When you become a leader, it just looks very different, right? And so, for example, that looks like when you are having a meeting with a funder as a leader, that funder, those representatives of the philanthropy, questioning your belonging or asking like, oh, who's the actual executive director or CEO? It's you. I can't tell you how many leaders like I've talked to where they're like, my identity as a leader has been misinterpreted or ignored entirely. Like, surely you cannot be leading this organization.
Welcome to the Tradeoff. I'm your host, Roslyn Smith. This is a show about the choices people make while building careers, movements, communities, and sometimes entire systems. Because behind every title, behind every achievement, behind every headline, there's usually a trade-off. What did it cost? What did it require? What did nobody see? And that's what we're exploring here. Not just what people build, but what they carry while building it. Today's guest is someone whose work sits at the intersection of justice, education, leadership, and systems change. Dr. Kevin Beckford is a researcher, strategist, nonprofit leader whose work has stretched from classrooms to national policy spaces, including service in the White House, and building initiatives centered on equity, belonging, and community power. But what stood out to me really wasn't just the resume. In my interaction with him, there's a question that we both came to. What happens when people what happens to people when we ask them to carry communities, institutions, and movements and forget to pour back into them? Today, we're talking about leadership, not the LinkedIn version, the human version. Dr. Beckford, welcome to the trade-off.
Rosalind, thank you so much for having me. I'm super excited for our conversation today. Peace and blessings to you.
Thank you so much. And really, to kick off this conversation, I want to start before the White House, before the accolades, before the research and leadership. Who were you before people started introducing you as Dr. Beckford?
Yes, that's a great question to kick us off. I was a lot of things. It was a brother, I was a son, I was a rebel rouser. I was known to be loquacious and unapologetic and convicted in everything that I said and did. And so, coming up as a child, I was often scolded by some and celebrated by others for having a mouth on me, right? And so I was that kid in school where, if I saw injustice, if there was a fellow student that was slighted, or if there was any type of discrepancy in terms of treatment particularly in collective spaces, I was causing hell, right? And that gave me, I got a lot of pushback from it, but I was also encouraged to be that way. Interestingly enough, I am of Jamaican heritage. My grandmother raised me, and she is of a very similar spirit. She came here, from the island, worked 3 jobs, had to advocate for herself and advocate for me, and very much encouraged, just like a spirit of like, yo, if you see something, like say something. And if you see somebody who can't do for themselves, you know, step in the fold and do whatever you can. I really attribute, I think, this particular, I guess, spice, if you will, in my personality, in my orientation, really to her in her movement. As coming up, I was an activist child. Obviously, I would be at school board meetings, questioning the school board council as to why in a predominantly Black and Latino area. I'm from Camden, New Jersey originally and grew up in the South Jersey area, but I went to these Black and brown schools. Why is it that like none of us are in the honors and gifted classes, right? make that make sense to me. Like I need to know like not only like why there is there is this disparity, right? But I would try to orient those adult stakeholders to solutions, like right. So it's like, okay, like are you guys looking at like testing for test scores, for example? Are you talking to parents? Are you engaging parents and families, about this opportunity? Because many of us, did not know of such things, right? And so that's who I was before this, just the mouthy rebel rouser, and unbeknownst to me, that was my currency. Like that was my, that's what allowed me to, ascend to the schools that I was able to attend. I went to Yale University as an undergrad. And for undergrad, majored in African American studies and political science, and had carried that same spirit, right? That same spirit of like, okay, provost, president, white institution of great resources. Let's hold you accountable. Or and not only just that, but like let's come up with solutions to challenges, at the school that Black and brown students, for example, may face. Let's, talk about town gown relations and the schisms that exist between the university and the city of New Haven, for example. And let's come up with some solutions, some strategies to implement to because it's not just about, running your mouth, which I can be decent at, but it's also about, coming up with policy recommendations and solutions to those problems. And so, yeah, that spirit of, not to beat a dead horse in this, but like that spirit of like just even when my voice shakes to just say something, right? To advocate. That has like that has bled into much of the work that I've done and much of the advocacy that I've taken on over the years.
So my mind is going in a lot of different directions here, particularly towards the end. You pointed out a dynamic that I think we are finding our way through right now. A lot of times we're very long on indignation, right? But we fall short when it comes to solution and actually putting forth policies and like a structure behind what it is we want to change. And I know there are instances where I've been guilty of that, and I've had to have really strong, people kind of help shift me from the place of the upset to, okay, what can we actually do about it? And I'm just thinking because I was also kind of a rebel child. I have a funny story when I after I graduated high school and I came back to visit my school a year after, I remember running into my principal and he shook my hand and he said, "Who are you lawyering now that you are in college?" Because I think when I graduated, they were like, "Okay, woo." They could like, enjoy their coffee in the morning before the first bell. Yes, but it's interesting being so young and having these experiences and maybe not recognizing the weight or the gravity of it or what that could lead to in your life. So was there a specific moment where you realized that, hey, this is actually my path? Did you always know that from day one and you just kind of had these, outward ways of expression that you eventually had to like figure out what to do with it?
That's an amazing question, and so I'll answer. I'll start by saying, it was always in my spirit. I don't know if necessarily knew if as a child and coming up, I thought I would professionally be an advocate, but it was just in my spirit to, particularly to advocate for us as a people, the respective communities that I was a part of, being, Jamaican American and seeing the unique circumstances that, West Indians we navigate, right? Or being African American and Black in this country and seeing like in, in our community, like some of the disparities that exist, like, right? I was just like, I just gotta say something, gotta do something. And I and it from a young age, and it's I've always had a sense of empathy and just like responsibility. I wouldn't even say I struggle with that word accountability, so I'll say responsibility. You know what I mean? I was like, I'm the kid who's in the library reading books and, I'm having conversations with adults. I'm positioned to represent. And so I'm just going to do it in whatever way I can. So if there is like a school dress code, for example, that I knew was unconstitutional per the conversations I was having with adults, I was like, no, 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 I'm not going to let this slide. I'm going to hold them accountable because we all know that this should not slide, right? So that was just who I was. But then there was a particular moment when I realized, okay, it was my calling, and it was a moment that was pretty challenging, for me. I was 15 years old. And long story short, I was going back and forth with the principal of the high school that I was attending, like in like the media. Like, so it wasn't even like one on one. It was like, you are writing op-eds, calling me out my name. Like, it's about to get rowdy because I got my uncles and cousins, and they feel a way about, this white man and who's principal of this black and brown school, literally, going toe to toe, and I would say in a dirty way with me, and I felt so, I felt very isolated. I felt called out. At a time, I was very down about it. But I think in that moment I kind of realized, like, okay, like, in this is perhaps my calling. The fact that, like, an old white man is jumping to this level of engagement, which is,
Right.
just
Right.
poor in my French. Whereas, like, I'm coming in with data and, the NAACP and civil rights organizations. I'm
Oh
coming in with,
my
like,
goodness.
legit fire, and you're calling me out my name, and you're misrepresenting that was a moment where I realized, okay, I may be positioned to do this, even when my voice shakes, even when you have those moments of nerves, and you're second guessing. It was like, no, like, this is a tail sign for me. And so that's when I knew. And I think, you have these moments as a leader and as an advocate, you have these moments of adversity that really built your character and really, like, position you for the next phase of it. And so as it would happen, I would be in these very similar situations with administrators at Yale, when I would call out racism and, and things that were problematic within that institution. And so, but it situated me. That moment in high school situated me to do so in college, and to, as an adult, navigate trolls on social media and Fox News DC, for example. I don't know if you're
Right.
familiar with their comment section. They will tear you apart, when you come with anything oriented to racial justice and solutions. So yeah, saying all that to say, like, I developed like a tougher, I developed a tougher skin from that first instance, and it was affirming. And I think after each instance of such of adversity, you can look back and you can reflect. And I'm at a point now where I lean into it. Like, whenever there is a naysayer, I'm like, let me really read, this comment, right? Or let me really engage this moment of adversarial nonsense, right? And really try to understand it, and really try to develop a strategy to engage it back. Or hell, sometimes it's like, let me just laugh at this person, because at this point, that's what has been built over the years, for me.
No, that is incredible. And another thing I'm learning we have in common, I also, as a very young person, child, was attacked by, and I believe hated by, some adults, including some adults in my family, because I too grew up from a family that was an immigrant family of Jamaican heritage. And I think that there is a dynamic of wanting to survive, right? And so, unfortunately, that survival instinct in some of my relatives manifested in a level of conformity,
Yeah.
or kind of playing the game is how it's called, right? And hypercriticism of behaviors or beliefs, or having a voice in spaces where they thought silence would make you more palatable or more conducive to some sort of worldly success. And you know what? I think in a certain era, there that was probably valid, and maybe that's still valid today in some aspects, depending on what industry you're in and what exactly it is that you're doing. So, but I agree with you in the sense that I feel like adversity has been my greatest teacher, and it causes you to run laps and to build up muscle memory that you could not build if everything was smooth sailing, or if you had the level of support that you thought you should have had at the time that you really needed it, right? So kudos to you for being this young person that just was committed to the journey, because I think some young people do get bullied out of either their calling or what they feel is right because they're the pressure to conform, especially, when you think of the hierarchy of these people are adults and I'm a child, and some cultural norms around, well, you're not being in a child's place if you are speaking out or you disagree. And I think particularly, and I don't know if this is just a Afro-Caribbean thing, I think sometimes the problem was if your arguments made sense and were grounded on logic, or like you talked about having data or those types of things. It's like sometimes I've had older relatives say I was rude, and it's not that I was rude. I look at those instances and it's like, no, I think I was right, but I don't think right maybe is the right way to frame it. It was, oh wow, she's standing on some sort of like evidence, like, I don't have a rebuttal. I just know what I think is best because that's what was taught to me, and that was what was
Right.
taught to my grandparents and the generations before that. So I'm right based off of what I know to be true based on what I was taught. And here is this young person coming up with a contradictory way of thinking and being that doesn't align with what I know is best based on our history.
Right, right. You nailed it on the head, and it's problematic, and that approach, to rearing and training up youth. There is data, and there's a lot of research that shows that when young people are reared to advocate for themselves, their outcomes as adults, is infinitely, better, right? They're able to go to school, they're more likely to go to like institutions of higher education, remain in those institutions, right? Because they're able, for example, to advocate for themselves and to speak back, right? They're able to, for example, construct resumes that are very reflective of the dynamic capabilities they possess. They're not downplaying themselves to fit in somebody else's mold or to be palatable, but they're real and celebratory of who they are, and in such instances, right? Like, we have to encourage young people to speak out, to be bold, to engage in dialogue, even when they may be wrong, right? Or there's a possibility of them being wrong or off, like, right? But you nailed it on the head, Rosalind. Like, there is this muscle memory that is produced as a consequence of continuously speaking up and speaking out, of engaging in dialogue, of constructing arguments. It's interesting because, like, it's so bizarre when I tell folk my story, because my grandmother is like, if you meet her, she is sweet, super kind, but she's nobody to play with. And she, real was very much her, my aunts, my uncles, contrary to perhaps, I think, other Afro Caribbean, and I would say immigrant, and, people of color orientations, they were like, speak your mind. They would listen. They would be like, no, you onto something, because you are thinking in ways that, I'm not able to, right? Because think about it, my rearing was here in the States, even as a child. My grandmother immigrated from a completely different country with a different code of society. And so she would be like, okay, like, what does that mean? Or like, how should I respond? She would ask me, who should I vote for? And I
Mm,
would tell her why, because I would be reading, engaging in the news in a way that she wasn't, because she was working three jobs, but she wanted to vote and she wanted to, like, do her part, right? So my family relied on me heavily. And I think, and I say this with humility, but to see what it's actualized in my own life, I am keen to doing that, when I work with young people and the work that I do, because I know there's such a power in using your voice, of speaking, out. And again, you may be wrong at times. You may fail, but that's like what life is. You have to have moments where you are wrong. You have to have moments where you lose an argument, right? Or otherwise, what have you built up for those moments where it really does matter, particularly in your adulthood, in adult, right? And so I'm working, for example, with a number of I've worked with a number of youth advocates in both the education and criminal justice spaces, in particularly in Washington, D.C. and New York City. And these young people speaking on issues like segregation in New York City. So New York City has the most segregated schools in the United States of any major city, contrary to like what we think of New York as a cosmopolitan city. New York has been because of screening processes, right? At the middle school and high school level, which allows school administrators to say, "Oh, nope, you've are from this neighborhood," or "Oh, nope, you have this certain attendance," or whatever the case may be. They can do that, right? So I've worked with young people actually to use their voice through a group called Teens Take Charge, and they successfully, in within a 2-year period, advocated against the use of screening at the middle school level. And so,
Wow.
yeah, yep, yep. And so, a policy that had existed for decades and decades. You had adults, have engaging in debates over whether or not screens should exist, and
Hmm.
they were the ones that went to media, they went to media, they wrote op-eds, they submitted testimonials to the school board, and they organized marches and rallies, and they were the ones that were successful in, that policy change, right? There are students and young people in DC right now that are leading the charge in conversations around curfew and racial profiling in the district. And while the adults are having one, I think, antiquated and very distant conversation, it's the young people that are saying no. Like, these are the disparities that exist within the system, right? These are the challenges we face when and DC have, recently has a curfew, and it's been
Really?
extended.
I did not know this.
Yeah, so there's a youth curfew that is in place in DC. It's been all of in the mainstream conversations, in the policy conversations, it's been woefully problematic in that adults are talking about curfews as a solution to public safety challenges, if you will, even though crime in DC, particularly youth crime, has actually gone down, in spite of the fact that, young people, and this is what they're leading the charge with in their conversations, they're saying like, hey, we have jobs. You know what I mean? Like, we work on the weekends, right? We support our families, and we are the collective tissue to our communities thrive in. And this curfew interferes with my ability to work on the weekends, right? And they're also the ones who are leading the conversation around like gentrification and displacement by saying, hey, my family lived in this certain neighborhood that you are selectively enforcing this curfew in, and these 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 policies of profiling, if you will.
I have a question for you about
Yeah,
this because I'm
yeah.
I'm a I'm conflicted, and I'll tell you why. I hear people talk about we want safer communities. So I need your help maybe decoding because on the surface you say safer community. Well, who doesn't want a safer community, right? So when we talk about the conversations that are actually happening, what do people actually mean when they say we want a safer community? And how are some of the conversations around public safety changing? Because when I'm listening to you now, it almost sounds like there is a fear of young people.
Yep.
So let's unpack that a little bit.
That's a brilliant question. And I hear you on being conflicted. And I myself am have conflicts as the framing of the public safety challenges in places like Washington, D.C. and elsewhere are very skewed, right? And so oftentimes I would implore us to ask, what are the questions we're raising, to the top as we think about public safety, and who is a part of those conversations? I can tell you this, in DC, the public safety conversation has been more about managing the discomfort of a few and new residents of a certain type versus protecting the safety of long-term Washingtonians and long-term members of communities, and particularly Black and brown folk and youth. So Washington, D.C., for example, is it is the city that has experienced the most displacement and gentrification of any major city in the United States. There is a ward in DC, Ward 6, that was predominantly Black and brown up into the early 2000s, where there was rapid displacement. This area, the Navy Yard area, is now once predominantly Black neighborhood is and ward is now predominantly white. And I'm sharing this, given this context because if you looked at like how policing and public safety was approached in that neighborhood, 20, 25 years ago, that looked very different to what it looks like now, drastically different, right? And so now because there are white folk in that area, because, there are high luxury buildings in that neighborhood, the policing has become as is transformed from a community driven approach that where officers in those communities got to know residents and know people and respond holistically to the public safety challenges that existed, right? Because public safety is more than just than something punitive, right? Or that should involve officers, but it should involve mental health intervention, like, right? So if somebody has an episode, like, right, for example, 20, 25 years ago, officers would be trained and oriented to say, like, okay, like, we see this episode, or we see this instance of loitering, let's contact a community organization that is best fit to intervene in this moment, right? Let's not send them to jail. Let's not harass. Like, right? That was like the orientation, the ideal orientation, and what I've in speaking to people more common than now, where it's aggressive, where it is there is an
Mhm.
explicit profiling. I've experienced it myself. I've had an advocate for young people because I live in the area, where it's like officers are waiting by, the transportation metro stops just to harass young people, just to say like, hey, there's a curfew, or like, hey, like, you don't belong here. I've witnessed, there was one time I was leaving the gym. There was a young man, I believe to be on the spectrum of autism, was differently positioned in this world. This young man, he works at a supermarket nearby, and basically he knows to work, to get on the train, to go home. I'm, in the area, I'm leaving the gym, I'm getting on the train to go home, and I see this officer harassing this young man. There's a curfew, da 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 da, he's in his face, and I'm like, sir, first of all, he's living differently in this world, and you can't tell? Second of all, that's a grown man. Like, he's an adult. Like, right? So when we think about, like, the officer kind of scurried away, the young man looked disheveled, he was nervous, he got on his train, and I've seen him since, but who knows how he slept that night, or like what type of trigger or trauma that induced in him. And so I share that story and all of this to say the ways in which we approach public safety, they really have to be, they have to be genuine. They have to be situated on really trying to protect the community and the community at large, and not just the interest of a few or the new. Right. When we think about public safety, we have to be holistic and embracing of different strategies. We have to be multi pronged. It's not just let's send people to jail. And while DC doesn't have like, like, you can send somebody to jail, and we don't have cash, we have a cashless bail system here, which is unique. And that's being threatened right now, right? Because of the changing gentrification and changing realities. And that's a system that actually works and keeps people, out of jail and able to go to court and pay their bills and go to work and do all the things, like, right, that's a lot of that's being threatened now because we're reverting back in how we think about public safety, because one of the reasons being we're trying to protect the interest of a select few.
Wow. Wow, so this young man literally is doing the right thing by going to work,
Yeah.
making an honest living, and is subject to profiling because of said curfew. I mean, what would it look like, or what is the process to even addressing this orientation? Is there a pathway to returning to kind of that community set neighborhood watch, or just orientation around community and not just protecting maybe elite special interests? And what might it look like to re-engage nonprofits and maybe even young people themselves and bring them into the conversation? Because to me, there's nothing about what you described that seems like it's inclusive of the community that has been there for a long time. I feel like things happen, and there's a lot of things happening right now, right? And it's almost like we don't necessarily know what to do in order to address what just occurred. And sometimes we see it as a regression, and maybe the strategies that got us to that achievement at one point in time aren't necessarily what we would deploy in the era that we're in.
Exactly. You're spot on. You're spot on, right? And so I think there's a few things that need to happen for us to move beyond the status quo of approach and strategy that is now, and to, yeah, do what is effective. We know from research, and we know so much data shows us that community driven approaches that are inclusive and holistic are best for communities, micro communities like neighborhoods, to to cities, and to, to our society at large. And so what we have to do, and we continuously do, is have conversations, engage in dialogue that is multi-pronged, and not just occurring whenever there is an instance, right, that makes the news, like, right, where it's like, oh, there's this public safety crisis, or, we shouldn't, and we shouldn't, we can't wait until a moment where, for example, somebody, dies, or, there is some type of malfunction to which we're responding. We have to be proactive. We have to have proactive conversations on topics such as gentrification, right? And I think that's one of the things I have really tried to push, and working with some youth advocates and advocates in DC in particular, because displacement is really what, displacement is a public health crisis. It is a public safety crisis, that doesn't get posited that way. So much stems from it, everything from employment opportunities or lack thereof, housing, criminalization, and in this, as we're talking about in this instance, like, right, so it starts with having conversations, and, and making connections on topics such as displacement, and gentrification, and rising costs of living, and the economy. And so it starts there, having these holistic and inclusive conversations, so you can really, because the thing is, like, you can't really solve we said this earlier, but you really can't solve a problem if it's not diagnosed correctly.
Mm.
And we really haven't diagnosed, and really, like, unearthed, I think, accurate pictures of, like, what's really happening in our communities. And so it starts with that, for certain. Having said that, the answers are there, and I think that oftentimes the answers are actually in community. The answers are in, as you said, referred to, Rosalind, these nonprofits and these organizations that, like, have the resources and the training and the research and the attention to actually go in and diagnose and address, a particular element of the problem, right? And so that's a big part of it, is like, our systems, our policymakers have to be mindful of that. And that looks like giving them resources and giving them support funding, for example, to do what they need to do. That means passing policies that allow them to function in that way, like, right? Because so oftentimes we look to our nonprofits to solve problems, and it's like, well, they can solve them, but they can also, like, diagnose them, and they can also prevent them, right? And so, like, let's think about, like, how we engage, those nonprofits and those advocates, and, the people in the community that are best situated to elevate, the community.
Right, and I think even at the nonprofit level, I look at the leadership opportunity to say, "Hey, if you have this mission and you have been trusted by the powers that be with a resource in order to diagnose, address, help fix, and so forth, that you're also engaging the community in a manner that is respectful and appropriate, and that you're committed to solving in partnership with community, because I think sometimes organizations might feel like they know the solution, right? And I get that, because I think there's a lot of times, like, you have smart people that are highly educated and have looked at models and done studies and so forth, right? But sometimes it's hard to get the community on board if it feels like you are telling them what to do, as opposed to bringing them along for the journey. And as a nonprofit leader, being willing to refine and modify what you're doing so that you have the trust of the community as you move forward to fix whatever that element of the issue is.
Exactly. Agreed completely. Completely agreed. And, it's interesting because a lot of So how nonprofits came to be in this country, at least, was to function in that way. So it's kind of intentional, where government saw themselves to be inadequate, or just, to be keeping it real, not willing or caring to address. It's like, okay, we'll just give it to these other entities, right? These other, like, good doers in the world. And so that this notion of being one directional, right? In more prescribing of problems from the nonprofit perspective, that's by design, and that's how they came about. And then you look at, like, how nonprofits are, situated in this country, like, tax breaks and the different
Right.
incentives to do good. A lot of times it's like, okay, like, it's like, so for so many of these institutions, and I'm thinking particularly like philanthropy, for example, like those who, really have an incentive to give away money so that they, aren't taxed, or like, or responsible for another type of spending to the government. That's kind of what we have now, which is, this, the notion of the nonprofit industrial complex it's very pervasive. The approaches to community solutions, and one could argue, I would argue, that as it's situated now, it's not the most effective. And it's so unfortunate, because so many of us come into nonprofit work, wanting to make change, wanting to
Exactly.
make a difference. We come in with a mission, we come in with a goal, we come in with a story, of our own that drives us. But then when you get into these, nonprofit spaces, when you get into leadership in particular, you're like, oh my God, like, this is not situated for me to be, effective in the way that I would want to be. And so there then becomes this, personal and professional schism that many of us, as nonprofit leaders, we have to consider.
Absolutely. And I think one of my most disappointing and hurtful experiences is being in the midst of nonprofits that perpetuate some of these elitist attitudes that hurt the community. And I am a believer that you cannot look down on the people that you are supposed to be serving. And sometimes I have not added to my fan club for calling out leaders for this. And of course, no one ever wants to look in the mirror or to be told that they're elitist or biased, especially because here's the other thing. Especially if you are a nonprofit leader that is a person of color serving a community of color, there is tendency to overlook maybe ways that you're behaving that is not unlike when we look at the mainstream culture and say, well, this is hurtful, or you're projecting a certain value or system that just doesn't work here. That's not what your job here is, not to do that, right? So a lot to unpack there. I might have to have an entire episode just
Yeah.
about nonprofits and being mission driven. But more than that, I would love to talk about some of the nonprofit work that you're involved in now, and kind of share with listeners how they can support the work that you're doing.
Yes, absolutely. So, Rosalind, I think you probably will have to do probably a series on nonprofit. 'Cause, woo, you could just thematically go through it. But yes, so, I've been in the nonprofit space for really my entire life. Professionally, over 13 years. But, I've worked and volunteered in nonprofits, from my churches to youth councils to different groups, my whole life. And one thing that I've come to learn, and, working with leaders and then being a leader myself, is that there's often this, like, personal and professional schism that so many leaders deal with, that, like, does not that is not like it's hard to address it, because there is no institutional acknowledgement, or, like, opportunity to really go through that, right? And so, you mentioned something powerful, Rosalind, that I just want to name and call out very quickly. And it's just like this reality of leaders, like, having to, or not having to, but leaders making decisions that sometimes do not reflect the mission, that do not reflect the purpose of the organization and its founding. And it's because there are other considerations that are structurally in place that run, you know, that does not run parallel, to that mission, right? And so one of the things that leaders struggle with, that I've struggled with, is like, okay, like if there is, for example, if there are employees, right, or that are feeling mistreated or feeling unheard, right, or feeling like they don't have the support to thrive in the work environment, but then the reality is like you have a limited budget, right? Where, as an organization, you're thinking like, well, there's work that has to get done, right? Or like, I don't have the funds to pay for professional development, nor may not have the currency of time, you right, to engage in, this person, or these group of people working, on this very important mission. Leaders struggle with that. Leaders struggle with making, hard decisions in that way of navigating, terrain that may not necessarily be situated for them to like truly, and this is the kicker, like truly actualize the mission. Because when you do what's right, you're actually going to like get closer to like getting that mission done, but it's not designed that way. And that's been a big part of my, as a you asked what I do, and explicitly, one of the things that I do as a researcher, I engage with Black male leaders in particular. So Black male leaders of education nonprofits. Many of them, have excelled in career, but many of them have had to navigate difficult questions and challenges as it pertains to board governance and fundraising and resourcing and HR and hiring and firing, as particularly as things like, as Black men, right, where there's so much to unpack with our identities and presentation. But much of what you shared, Rosalind, is, in that question and a setup, I've unearthed in my own research, and I'm happy to share that with any of the listeners. It's if you look me up, Dr. Kevin Beckford, with the word Vanderbilt, my research should come up immediately. I presented it across the country at conferences, and not just like the typical sedity, academic conferences, but like in workshops in communities. I've done one-on-ones at churches. I've done one-on-ones with with nonprofits to kind of unearth and or to go through the themes of some of what you just raised, Rosalind. I also serve as a nonprofit leader myself, and so like this is very personal to me. So I've led advocacy work at a number of nonprofits over the years. Currently, I am a senior associate leading partnerships and engagement and advocacy work with the Pretrial Justice Institute, which is a research and technical assistance organization seeking to end mass incarceration starting at pretrial. I also am a co-founder of a nonprofit called the Hustlers Guild. We work alongside youth in Washington, D.C., New York, and across the country to actualize workforce development opportunities for young people through hip hop in our culture. So much of our culture is exploited. A lot of folk make money off of Black culture, right? And so this particular effort aims to bring money back to those who create culture, whether that culture be expressed in sports, in music, entertainment, or technology.
And so if we were to tie in a neat bow, if it's even possible, what is currently missing from the conversation about Black men in leadership?
That is a great question. I'm trying my best to be brief. Be brief, be brief, be brief, be succinct. One thing that's missing off the top of the dome: acknowledgement. Black men in leadership do not feel seen. They don't feel seen. They don't feel cared for. They feel that they are an afterthought. They feel a lot of things as it pertains to their ascension to leadership. Many of them have, worked incredibly hard to, get to places of leadership. And, it's multi-pronged because so many Black male I'll say Black female leaders as well, because there's a lot of cross pollination of themes and experiences within the two groups, but my research focuses particularly on Black men. Our ascension to leadership is one that reflects work so hard. We're mission driven. We navigate through a lot of BS, to get to these places, because it's even though we want to do right by community, it's really hard to get to that place in a leadership capacity. And once you get there, it's kind of like you're thrown there, you're thrown into it, and it's like, okay, be a magical unicorn, solve everything, and we're not going to acknowledge the fact that education, the classroom space, the nonprofit space is very antagonistic to the lived experience and the functionality of like how we're reared as Black men.
Mm.
Like, it's like, right? Like, you think about, like, the school to prison pipeline even going back to, our childhood and the fact that, like, we are criminalized, as Black boys in classrooms for being children. Those type that same dynamic exists. It doesn't go away when you become a leader, it just looks very different, right? And so, for example, that looks like when you are having a meeting with a funder as a leader, that funder, those representatives of the philanthropy, questioning your belonging or asking like, oh, who's the actual executive director or CEO? It's you. I can't tell you how many leaders like I've talked to where they're like, my identity as a leader has been misinterpreted or ignored entirely. Like, surely you cannot be leading this organization or leading this effort, right? So it's things like that, or it's things like having to feeling like you have to be palatable or like you have to like downplay your personality or your presentation or, particularly, especially as a Black man, like you cannot be upset. You cannot be angry because that will be misconstrued for aggressiveness and being antagonistic. And it's like oxymoronic because I'm the leader. Hold up. You telling me I can't check nobody as the leader
And
of this
challenge
organization?
and to function, especially if we're talking nonprofit, if you are
Yeah.
mission driven, right, and you're fixing a problem, there's a
Yeah.
level of having to challenge
Yes.
and reframe arguments in order to actually accomplish your mission.
Yeah.
That's a function of operating in your mission, that you have to be
Exactly.
at the table
You have
asking some
to.
tough questions.
Exactly, right? And so these are the things that like leaders of color, notably Black men, and as exposed in my research, experience, right? And talking to solutions, like because like it's important to diagnose the problem and to create a clear picture of the problem, but then let's just talk solutions. And so, what is that? How do we acknowledge that, or how do we particularly as leaders of color, how do we get through that, right? A few things. One, affinity groups. Join an affinity group, join a tribe, join a community, have conversations of amongst other leaders who may be experiencing the same things. One, for your own affirmation and your assurance of like, no, you're not crazy. This is set up for you to feel crazy. But like, here are also some solutions. I've been through that, or I've been through that, or I've been through that. So let's workshop and, come up with solutions, right? So there's affinity spaces, joining those. Mentorship, finding a mentor. Those who have the leaders I've worked with and and mind you, my study was a mixed method study, so there was qualitative and quantitative aspects. So I did interviews, in-depth interviews with grown men who I thought was the strongest, beat your chest, toughest guy in the world, crying for 4 hours, right? And so like I had
Wow.
that, and I did surveys, and I talked to, I also in my research work with experts, those who provide support with such leaders, right? All of that to say, mentorship like has been the one thing that unearthed, like, nothing is new under the sun, right? And so like if you are able to find somebody who's been through potentially what you've gone through, to bounce ideas off, to engage in dialogue, to be affirmed by, to be pointed in the right direction, that is also like paramount to not just professional ascension to leadership, but just like ultimate satisfaction to it as well. Developing skills is another thing, that is grossly underscored, amongst leaders. So often as a leader, you're thought to be somebody to just provide all the solutions, right? But the reality is like in order to be a leader, you must be skilled and you must be multi-pronged in your skill set. And while you have folk that may be carrying out certain functions, like it's important for you to like understand and be well versed in the various functions of your nonprofit or your effort. And for Black men in particular, oftentimes the ascension to leadership is such that there was no pipeline. It wasn't this. Rarely is it pipeline, and rarely
Mm.
do folks think about like, let's curate this leadership development. Like, right, like oftentimes you're just thrown in to the wolves, and that's the experience of many. And so it's like, wait, I am now like a CEO of an organization. Now I've never written a grant, or I've never like talked to a funder. I don't know like the fundraising landscape of this sector. And now you have me responsible for raising $4 million a year, right? And granted, like many of us, we find a way and we do it and we do it well, but like a
At
lot
what
of them,
cost? At what
at what
cost?
cost?
Yeah.
And it comes at a gross cost for us in particular, right? Like it comes at a gross like cost in terms of identity, in terms of our fulfillment and being satisfied with the job. It comes at a cost of even families. You know, I can't tell you how many leaders I've talked to who've said like, yeah, I'm doing well, like, professionally, but like, my just got divorced. Or, I'm rarely home, or like my mental isn't where I would want it to be, even, right? And so that question of at what cost is one I think should be at the forefront of the minds of leaders. And I say, again, my research is the context of Black male leaders, but I will say leaders of all persuasions. And I would say even youth leaders too, because I work with them. I always tell them that, well, the folk I work with, I always try to impress this point of like, at what cost? Like, is it a cost for your peace? Is it at cost of your financial navigation and you being able to just survive in this world? Like, at what cost? Like, you have to ask yourself these questions internally, and then also, if you're willing to go through the work, finding things that are addressed, those things that are like present costs. Like, you don't want costs. Gas is $13 a
Right,
gallon. We don't
right.
need more cost. Okay, like let's address like if there is a cost, let's minimize that cost. Let's ideally eliminate it altogether so I can do this work, because it should not cost you to do good work in the world. It should not cost you to want to be a good person, to want to impress change. Again, many of us come in this with our mission at heart. We should not be dying to
Correct.
do good.
Correct. So, and as we're winding down here, and we consider the cost, right? And this platform in particular, the trade-off, right? What happens to people when we ask them to carry communities, institutions, and movements and forget to pour back into them?
Nothing good. Nothing good and nothing sustainable. Nothing good and nothing sustainable. Even if you are able to, if they are able to push forward admission for, it's only going to be for a short time. And you think of the effects of that, not just for that person, which is bad, but for the movement at large. Like it like when you have leaders who are falling apart, who are not growing and sustaining in their leadership, that's very disruptive, to the tissue of the movement, of the nonprofit efforts, right? And so we have to be mindful of pouring into our leaders. And it doesn't necessarily mean, for example, being hyper celebratory, because there's another end of it. There are some leaders who, in their organizations, they are like viewed as God. They are esteemed. They are given the very few, but they are there where they're
Right.
giving the golden key to do whatever they want. Right. 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 That's not what we need to be doing. What we need to be doing is pouring in to leaders by acknowledging them first and foremost, saying, acknowledging and supporting them and their humanity. In my research, a lot of the Black men that I've interviewed and have worked with, there's this like, I want to be my authentic self, right? I just want to be authentic. I just want to be me. And so we have to think about, okay, like our institutions, our sectors, how are we ensuring that there's opportunity for people to just be their authentic selves, to not have to code switch, right? Because we know that code switching doesn't always have a good psychological effect on us, right? And so pouring in requires, creating systems and processes that allow folk to bring their authentic selves, to the work that they do. It also means curating things like pipelines, like being intention. It requires an intentionality of saying like, okay, like we're not just going to throw you into leadership, right? We're going to like situate your leadership experience as something that is progressive, as something that is intentional, that it's reflected in developing your skill set, professional development. It's reflected in curating a culture. And that's another piece of it that could be a whole different podcast. But like, the culture of these nonprofits are rather antagonistic to who many of us are as people, despite the fact that many of us come here because we want to do things for our people, right? And so that's another thing too that is necessary to pour in. It's really challenging and changing the cultures of those nonprofits. I could talk on for days and days on this. I'm gonna stop right
Oh,
there.
absolutely, absolutely. As a matter of fact, I'm like, you know what? That nonprofit series, it's just gonna have to happen. We're gonna have to make it happen. And as we're closing out, there is a four-letter word that you and I have talked about offline that I think is a good way to close this conversation, especially in light of everything that you just described and what people who are committed to doing good in the world, what they're carrying, right? And that word, LOVE, love, yeah. And so I've read some of your work, particularly around the New York City school system and so forth. And what I also found was your children's book, Khalil's Got Love.
Yes.
So I would like to hear from your perspective the role that love can play in healing our communities and how we just move through different spaces.
That's a great question, Roslyn. And again, thank you for acknowledging my background. And I didn't know that you had come across the book, but for folk
That's
listening,
me. That's me.
yeah.
You don't see me coming, but
Right. I love it. But yeah, to the folk that are listening, I recently penned a book called Khalil's Got Love. It's a nod to my grandmother and the family that raised me, a family that was, situationally unconventional, right? But like had the ability to provide so much love to me. And to answer your question, Rosalind, in turn, that love that was provided, to me reflected in the book, but reflected in my life, it's really motivating me to want to do good in the world, to be a light, to be positive. I think when we orient from a place of love, so much else is mitigated, right? And so whether it be ego, whether it be fear, when we lean into this idea of wanting to love others and to do because we have love for self and others, particularly our communities, uh, we orient to better solutions. We orient to better conversations. We become more inclusive. When you think about, when you operate from a place of love, you want to make sure that everybody's good, that everybody is included in conversations, that you're not replicating harm, right? Because the reality is, because so much of these systems and institutions were not built for repair, right? Even though we want to do good, many of us are part of institutions. We're a part of a greater system that does not want to do the same repair that we want to do, right? And so if we are consistently being introspective and placing love first and thinking about our relation to love, it allows us to be better strategists. It allows us to be better leaders, to be more thoughtful, to perhaps be more challenging when necessary as things go awry, or you find like a challenge even within the good nonprofit or the good sector of education or public safety, where, again, like it's not designed for us to, for repair, to really do what we want to do. And so I think just coming from a place of love is so paramount. I think it's a modality that it mitigates so much other things. Sometimes it's like, okay, like I don't know what to do when I have, this, I don't know, for example, this directive that says, okay, I have to fire somebody but I know they're doing good work and I know their family situation and I know more context. Well, being that I'm operating from a place of love and I'm considering, them holistically and their value in different ways, I could be like, no, I'm going to advocate for them to stay on. Or, okay, like I see there may have been this one mishap, but perhaps this may be something within system that we need to, or within the organization we need to evaluate closer. Or maybe it's like, okay, like, well, let's talk to her and see what happened, him or her, and see what they may be better placed, within an organization, right? But like in this particular example, I wouldn't arrive to that unless I came from a place of love.
Right.
And so it sounds cliche and it sounds like, maybe like Miss America or Miss Universe, like to just like say, no love, love,
World
no, no,
peace.
like
That's all I
world
want
peace
is
and
world
love
peace.
and light. But it's so simple, but it's just it's real. Like it love really mitigates so much, and there's a lack of it in this world. And so if there's one message I would employ all of the listeners here is to really evaluate your relationship with love. Think about the ways in which you show love to yourself, love to your family, and love to those in community. And then try to be intentional in replicating efforts and to be continuous in it.
Thank you so much for making space for this conversation and really helping us to think more deeply about what it means to effectuate change and build systems and movements and be a part of advancing our communities without losing our humanity.
It's been my pleasure, Roslyn. Thank you so much for inviting me to have this conversation. It's always a joy. It's always a pleasure to talk to you. I feel like I was like, mind is going in 15 different directions. And I'm
Same,
like,
same. Yeah.
limit yourself, limit yourself, limit yourself, limit yourself. Try to be succinct. Try to, address the question. But, this is such a powerful and important platform. I love how you situate conversations. You have a true gift in this space. And I'm just excited to hear future episodes and to see future guests and hear what they have to share. But thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Have a good one. Take care.
You too. Take care.